There's a certain kind of fear that doesn't come from darkness. It doesn't hide under your bed. It doesn't whisper from empty hallways. It sits across from you at dinner. It smiles in photographs. It answers when you ask, "How was your day?" And that's what makes it dangerous. Because the most disturbing things don't look disturbing at all. They look normal, comfortable, safe. Tonight's story isn't about something supernatural. There are no monsters here, at least not the kind you expect. This is a story about patterns, about behavior, about the quiet details people overlook until it's too late, and maybe as you listen, you'll start to notice something not in this story, but in your own life. Because sometimes when everything looks fine, it isn't. The report began the way most reports do: short, clinical, easy to ignore. A missing person case, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no immediate evidence of a struggle, just absence. The name in the file was asterisk Daniel Hardrow, 36 years old, accountant, lived alone, no criminal history, no known conflicts, no recent travel. On paper, Daniel Hargrove was the kind of person investigators quietly appreciate. Predictable, routine driven, uncomplicated, the kind of life that leaves behind clean timelines and minimal surprises, which is exactly why his disappearance didn't make sense. Because people like Daniel don't just vanish, they follow patterns, and patterns leave traces. Daniel lived in a quiet residential block, the kind where nothing unusual ever seems to happen. The neighbors described it the same way they always do: peaceful, normal, everyone keeps to themselves. And Daniel fit that description perfectly. He left for work at 8:10 every morning. Not 8 odd, not 8:15. 8:10, he returned home at 6:05 in the evening. He parked in the same spot, walked the same path to his door, checked his mailbox even when it was empty. Routine, precise, repetitive, reliable is the kind of life that becomes invisible over time, because when nothing changes, people stop paying attention. The first person to notice something was wrong was not family, not a close friend. It was the building's maintenance supervisor, a man named Farouk. He wasn't looking for Daniel. He was responding to a complaint: water leakage from the unit below. A slow drip through the ceiling, annoying, inconvenient, but nothing serious. At least not at first. Farouk knocked on Daniel's door at 10:30 in the morning. No answer. That wasn't unusual. Daniel should have been at work, but procedure required entry if damage was suspected. So Farouk used the master key and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not just quiet, silence, the kind that feels complete, like the space itself is holding its breath. The second thing was the smell, not strong, not immediately alarming, just off, like something that didn't belong, something faintly metallic, something that made him pause for just a second longer than necessary. Everything else looked normal, painfully normal. The kitchen was clean, dishes washed, counters wiped, the living room was organized, nothing out of place, no signs of disturbance. The bedroom neatly made, blankets folded, pillows aligned. It didn't look like someone had left, it looked like someone had prepared to return. And that's where it became strange, because the details didn't match the situation. Daniel's wallet was on the table, keys beside it, phone charging. All the things a person carries with them when they leave were still there. People forget things sometimes: a phone, maybe even keys. But not everything, not all at once. Farouk didn't think in terms of danger, not yet. He thought in terms of inconvenience. A tenant who forgot something, maybe left in a hurry. But then he noticed something else: the clock. It was mounted on the wall above the television. A simple analog clock, nothing special, except it had stopped. Not broken, not damaged, just stopped at exactly asterisk 819 Taj want. Now on its own that means nothing. Clocks stop all the time. Batteries die, mechanisms fail. It's a small detail, the kind most people would ignore. But Farooq didn't ignore it. not because he was suspicious, but because something about it felt wrong. He couldn't explain it, and that's important because most people assume that danger announces itself clearly, that something will feel obviously wrong, obvious enough to act on immediately. But real situations don't work like that. Instead, you get small inconsistencies, tiny misalignments, details that don't fit but don't seem important enough to matter, and so you hesitate, you rationalize, you move on. That's what Farooq almost did until he walked toward the bathroom. The door was slightly open, just enough to show darkness inside, and that's when the smell became stronger. Not overwhelming, still subtle, but now unmistakable. He reached for the door, pushed it open slowly, and for a moment nothing happened. No sudden movement, no sound, and no clear explanation, just a room, still, quiet, unchanged. But something was wrong, not visible, not immediately, but present. The kind of presence you don't see, you feel it. And in that moment, before understanding, before clarity, before the mind has time to process, there's only one thought: this shouldn't be like this. And that thought is where everything begins to unravel. When the officers arrived, nothing about the exterior suggested urgency. No crowd, no raised voices, no flashing chaos, just a routine response to a maintenance report. Two officers stepped inside the apartment. They didn't rush, because at this stage there was no confirmed crime, only a situation that didn't make sense. The first thing they did was stop, not out of fear, out of instinct, because experienced investigators don't move immediately. They observed, they let the environment speak first. The apartment, at a glance, appeared untouched. No broken furniture, no overturned objects, no visible signs of conflict. Everything was aligned, too aligned. One officer walked slowly toward the kitchen, the other remained near the entrance. Not by accident. It's a quiet rule: never fully commit to a space until you understand it. The air felt still, not stale, not heavy, just undisturbed, like nothing had changed for hours or longer. The officer near the kitchen noted small details: a glass placed upside down on a drying rack, a chair pushed imperfectly beneath the table, a folded dish towel creased with intention. These weren't unusual things, but together they created a pattern of completion. People leave things unfinished, a cup left out, a drawer slightly open, a chair angled wrong. Life creates small imperfections. That's how you know someone was there. But here there were none. The second officer moved toward the hallway, each step measured, each movement controlled, because when a place is too normal, you don't trust it. The bedroom confirmed the same impression. The bed was made with near precision, not casually, deliberately. The kind of effort that suggests awareness, not routine. On the nightstand, a book, closed, not bookmarked, which meant one of two things. Either it hadn't been read recently, or someone had taken the time to reset it. Again, not alarming, but intentional. The officer stepped back into the hallway and looked toward the bathroom. The same door Farooq had opened earlier, still slightly ajar. This time the smell was no longer subtle. It was defined, not strong enough to cause immediate reaction, but specific enough to register. The officer didn't enter immediately. Instead, he waited. That pause matters because trained individuals don't just react, they assess, they compare what they're sensing to what should be there. And in that moment, something didn't match. The door was pushed open slowly, no sudden movement, no shift in air, just a gradual reveal of the space inside. The bathroom light was off. Natural light from a small frosted window filled the room just enough to see. Everything inside appeared in place, sink clean, mirror clear, no visible disturbance. But there was something else, something subtle, something that required attention. The shower curtain. It was fully closed, not partially, not uneven, perfectly drawn across. Now that alone means nothing. But in a setting where everything else suggests completion, it becomes a detail worth noting. The officer stepped closer. Not rushed, not hesitant, just controlled. And then he stopped. Not because of what he saw, but because of what he didn't. There were no water droplets, no signs of recent use, no steam residue on the mirror, and yet the curtain remained closed, which suggested one thing: it hadn't been used, but it hadn't been opened either. That contradiction was the first real break in the pattern. The officer reached forward, pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. An empty tub, dry, clean, unremarkable. But now the room felt different because once a pattern breaks, you start looking closer. The second officer entered the bathroom. His attention moved immediately to the floor, not because there was something obvious, but because trained eyes look where others don't, and that's when he saw it. Near the edge of the tile, barely visible, a faint discoloration, not large, not dramatic, just a slight difference in tone. Something that had been cleaned carefully, but not perfectly. The kind of mark most people would never notice unless they were looking for it. The officer didn't speak immediately. He crouched, examined it more closely, then stood and said something simple, something quiet but important. We're not looking at a disappearance, a pause. This is something else. No assumptions, no conclusions, just a shift in direction. Because investigations don't begin with certainty, they begin with recognition. Recognition that something doesn't belong. Outside the apartment, everything remained calm. The street unchanged, the routine of the neighborhood uninterrupted. No one watching would have known that inside that quiet space a line had just been crossed, not visibly, not dramatically, but definitively. Because the moment you stop asking, "Where did he go?" and start asking, "What happened here?" you're no longer looking for a person, you're looking for the truth, and the truth rarely stays hidden for long, even in places where everything looks fine. Understood. I'll continue in the same asterisk slow burn procedural rounded style asterisk, keeping it asterisk and monetization safe, while naturally adding subtle emotional cues like you requested. This remains asterisk standalone part. Um, Investigations rarely begin with answers. They begin with structure, a timeline, because time, unlike people, doesn't lie. The first step was simple: reconstruct Daniel Hargrove's last known movements, not assumptions, not theories, just facts. His workplace confirmed he had arrived on time the previous morning, 8:47 a.m., logged in, accessed files. Responded to emails, nothing unusual. Colleagues described him the same way everyone else had: quiet, focused, predictable, a man who followed routines so precisely that deviation would be obvious. But there was no deviation. Not at work, not yet. At 12:12 p.m., he sent his final email. A routine response, short, clear, professional. No urgency, no indication of distraction, and then nothing. No logout record, no further activity, no farewell, just silence. Ha! That alone wasn't enough to raise alarm. People step away from desks, they take calls, they leave early sometimes. But Daniel didn't. Security footage showed him leaving the building at 12:26 p.m., calm, unhurried, walking exactly the way he always did. No one stopped him. No one spoke to him. He exited through the main doors and disappeared from the frame. That was the last confirmed sighting. From that moment on, everything depended on reconstruction. Investigators pulled external cameras, street views, traffic feeds, anything that could extend the timeline, and they found him 12:31 p.m. crossing the street 2 blocks away, 12:34 p.m., standing briefly outside a convenience store, not entering, just standing. That was the first irregularity. Daniel was not someone who paused without purpose. His movements were efficient, intentional. But here he lingered for 11 seconds, then walked away. No purchase, no interaction, just presence. It was subtle, almost meaningless, but in structured lives, small changes matter. The next camera picked him up at 12:42 p.m., Turning onto his street, same posture, same pace, nothing outwardly different. And then he reached his building. 12:47 p.m. The footage showed him entering through the main door. No hesitation, no sign of distress, just routine. And after that, nothing. No footage of him leaving, no secondary exit, no visual record beyond that point, which meant one thing: whatever happened, happened inside. Shh. The investigators returned to the apartment with this in mind, not searching randomly, but aligning the timeline with the environment, because when time stops, you look for where it stopped. The clock on the wall. 8:19, the detail returned to relevance. At first, it had seemed incidental. Now, it became a marker. But something didn't align. Daniel had returned home at 12:47 p.m. So why would a clock stop at 8:19? Morning? Night? There was no immediate answer. But inconsistencies don't need answers right away. They need attention. Ah, the next step was digital analysis. His phone, still charging, still inside the apartment. Last activity, 12:51 p.m. A notification open, no response sent. After that, no usage, no calls, no messages, just silence. His laptop told a similar story. Last active session, 1:03 p.m. A document open, half completed, cursor blinking. That detail mattered because unfinished work is honest. It shows interruption, and interruption means something changed. Not humor, not relief, just the kind of quiet disbelief investigators sometimes feel when a pattern almost makes sense but doesn't, because everything suggested presence. He came home, used his phone, opened his laptop, normal behavior, until it wasn't. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage to locks, no disturbance in the apartment, which meant if someone else had been there, they were either allowed in or already inside. Huh, that thought shifted the tone, because now this wasn't just about what happened, it was about who had access, and access narrows possibilities. Investigators began reviewing known contacts, friends, colleagues, service providers, anyone who could enter that space without resistance. But Daniel's life offered very little. No recent visitors, no recorded appointments, no social activity, a routine life with no visible disruptions. Uh, and yet, something had interrupted it completely. The apartment still held its order, still reflected control, but now that control felt artificial, maintained, as if the normalcy had been preserved intentionally. Again, not humor, just that quiet recognition. Because when everything aligns too perfectly, it stops being natural. It becomes staged. And staged environments tell their own story. You just have to learn how to read them. By the end of the day, the investigation had changed direction. This was no longer a missing person case. Not officially, not yet. But in practice, the focus had shifted from searching outward to examining inward, because the timeline didn't extend beyond the apartment, it ended there. And when a timeline ends in a closed space, the answer isn't out there, it's already inside, waiting quietly, like everything else in that room that looked fine but wasn't. Mm. By the second day, the investigation had shifted, not officially, not in paperwork, but in mindset. Because something about Daniel Hargrove's case refused to behave like a normal disappearance. Ha! There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no clear point of conflict, and yet everything pointed to interruption. A life paused mid motion. That contradiction became the focus. Investigators don't just look for what's there, they look for what's missing. And in Daniel's case, something was. The team began reconstructing behavior, not just actions, patterns, daily habits, weekly routines, small consistencies most people never think about, because behavior, when repeated long enough, becomes predictable, and predictability is measurable. Daniel's purchase history was reviewed, same grocery store, every 3 days, same items, minimal variation. Receipts confirmed it. Last purchase 2 days before his disappearance, which meant he hadn't planned to leave. People who intend to disappear prepare. They withdraw money, pack essentials, break routine. Daniel had done none of that. His bank account showed no unusual activity, no large withdrawals, no sudden spending. Everything remained consistent. A game, not humor. Just that quiet recognition investigators get when everything is too consistent because real life is rarely perfect. There are always small deviations, but Daniel's pattern held firm. Until it didn't, attention shifted to communication. Call logs, messages, emails, nothing unusual, no arguments, no urgency, no emotional spikes. His last conversation, a brief exchange with a coworker. Routine, forgettable, no hidden meaning. Huh, which made it harder. Because when there's no conflict, there's no obvious cause. And without cause, you're left with possibility. Shh. Investigators began mapping physical space, not just the apartment but the building itself. Entry points, access routes, blind spots. Because if something happened inside, someone either entered or never left. The building had cameras, limited coverage, but enough to establish movement. Footage was reviewed carefully, frame by frame. No unknown visitors, no unfamiliar faces. Only residents, routine traffic, nothing that stood out. And that was the problem because in a case like this, something should stand out, but nothing did, which meant one of two things. Either nothing unusual happened, or it happened in a way that looked normal. That thought changed everything because now the focus wasn't on disruption, it was on disguise. The idea that whatever occurred fit seamlessly into the environment, unnoticed, unquestioned. Back inside the apartment, investigators revisited the space, not searching for evidence, but for behavior, because spaces reflect actions, even when those actions are hidden. The kitchen again unchanged, the living room still precise, the bedroom untouched, everything aligned, too aligned, too aligned. There it was again, that same feeling, not fear, recognition, because environments like this don't maintain themselves. Someone had preserved it recently, carefully, calm. That realization led to a new question, not what happened here, but what was kept from changing. Because natural spaces shift, dust settles, objects move, small imperfections appear. But here, those imperfections were missing, which meant someone had corrected them after the fact. That wasn't routine, that was intention. The bathroom was examined again. That faint mark on the tile, still there, still subtle, still easy to miss. But now it carried weight, because in a space this controlled, even the smallest imperfection matters. From forensic teams documented it carefully. No conclusions yet, just acknowledgement that something had been altered. And then another detail surfaced, small, almost irrelevant, the trash. It had been emptied recently, but there was no scheduled collection, no routine that matched it, which meant someone had removed something intentionally, without leaving a trace. Huh. Now the pattern was clearer. Not through presence, but through absence. Things that should have been there weren't. Things that should have changed hadn't. And that combination doesn't happen naturally. It happens when someone is trying to maintain control. Shh. The investigation had moved beyond surface level analysis. This was no longer about missing pieces, it was about hidden ones. Because the apartment wasn't just quiet, it was curated, maintained in a way that suggested awareness. And awareness means involvement. Again, not humor, just that quiet shift. The moment when uncertainty begins to narrow, when possibilities become directions, and directions lead somewhere. By the end of that day, one conclusion had settled in, not officially, not documented, but understood. This situation wasn't random, it wasn't accidental, and it wasn't spontaneous. It followed a pattern, a controlled one, a careful one, the kind of pattern that doesn't appear on its own. It's created, maintained, and hidden in plain sight. Because sometimes the most important pattern is the one that looks like it isn't there at all. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, even when everything still looks fine. Hmm. By the third day, the investigation had stopped expanding outward. It had narrowed, not because there were fewer leads, but because all leads pointed back to the same place, the apartment. Huh. When a case begins to close in like that, investigators change how they look at things. They stop searching for events and start searching for events and start searching for mistakes. Because no matter how controlled a situation appears, something always slips. Something small, something unintended, and often that's enough. The forensic team returned to the apartment early, this time not to observe, but to examine every surface, every corner, every detail that had previously seemed unimportant. Because once intention is suspected, nothing remains ordinary. The bathroom tile, that faint discoloration, was tested carefully, precisely. The results didn't confirm anything immediately, but they did one thing: they justified attention. And attention changes everything. Because once you focus on a detail, you begin to notice others, subtle ones, connected ones. Uh, the sink, it looked clean, but not naturally clean. Too uniform, no water spots, no irregular streaks, just a smooth, consistent finish. The kind that suggests recent wiping, but not routine wiping, careful wiping. Again, not humor, just that quiet moment of recognition, because when cleaning becomes precise, it stops being maintenance, it becomes correction. The mirror told a similar story: no smudges, no fingerprints, perfect clarity, even in areas people rarely notice, which meant someone had paid attention, unusual attention. The investigation shifted again. Now it wasn't about what had been done, but what had been undone, removed, adjusted, erased. Because removing something creates space, and space can be measured. Uh, the team began reconstructing the environment, not as it was found, but as it should have been, based on Daniel's routine, his habits, his consistency, and that's when it appeared, a gap. Not visible at first, but present. The bathroom shelf. It held standard items: toothbrush, soap, a folded towel, all aligned. But something felt incomplete, not missing in an obvious way, just slightly off. Investigators reviewed previous images, older photos from routine inspections, maintenance records, and there it was, a small item, unremarkable, previously placed in that exact spot. Now gone. Ha! It wasn't valuable, not important, but it mattered. Because in a controlled environment, removal is a choice, and choices leave meaning. Huh! The question wasn't what the item was. The question was why remove it at all. Ah, because if someone takes the time to preserve a space, to clean it, to maintain its appearance, they don't forget things. They decide what stays and what doesn't. That realization changed the tone completely, because now this wasn't just controlled, it was selective. And selection requires awareness. The timeline was revisited again. Daniel enters at 12:47, phone used at 12:51, laptop active at 103, then nothing. No movement, no activity, which meant whatever occurred happened within minutes. Quick, contained, and then managed. Ha! The absence of disruption made sense now. If the situation had been controlled early, there would be no chaos, no visible struggle, just silence, maintained silence. Investigators began considering proximity, not distance, but closeness, because access without disruption requires familiarity, comfort, recognition. Someone Daniel wouldn't question, someone who didn't trigger alarm, someone who could exist in that space without changing it. That possibility narrowed everything significantly. Ha! Back in the apartment, one final detail emerged, small, almost invisible. The edge of the door frame, near the bathroom. A faint mark, not damage, just pressure, as if something or someone had made contact briefly, then corrected it. It wasn't enough to explain anything, but it added weight because now there were multiple points of adjustment, multiple signs of correction, all subtle, all intentional, and when multiple small details align, they stop being random, they become pattern. By the end of the day, the investigation reached a quiet understanding, not spoken directly, but felt. This wasn't a disappearance, it wasn't confusion, and it wasn't chance. This was control, maintained after the fact, carefully, deliberately, because the apartment didn't just hold silence, it held effort. The effort to make everything appear unchanged, to make everything look fine. But now the illusion had cracks, small ones, precise ones, enough to reveal something underneath. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to know that something had happened, something that wasn't supposed to be seen, and yet left behind just enough to be noticed, if you knew where to look. And once you do, the space never feels the same again, no matter how normal it looks, because now you understand something important. Control leaves traces too, even when everything looks perfectly fine. By the fourth day, the investigation had moved away from the apartment, not because it was no longer important, but because it had already said everything it could. When a space stops giving answers, you look at people, not broadly. Specifically, because in controlled situations, there's usually one constant, someone who fits too well, someone who doesn't stand out, because they were never meant to. The list of individuals connected to Daniel Hardrow was limited. No close family nearby, no active social circle, a few co-workers, a few routine contacts, service providers, maintenance, delivery, people who pass through life without leaving an impression. And that's where investigators focused, not on relationships, but on access. Who could enter without being questioned? Who could be present without raising concern? Building records were reviewed again, entry logs, key access, maintenance schedules, everything aligned with procedure, no unauthorized entries, no forced access, which meant whoever was involved didn't break in, they belonged there. Not emotionally, functionally. They had a reason to be there, a valid one, and that made them invisible. The maintenance schedule stood out. Routine inspections, repairs, follow ups, normal activity, expected movement, nothing unusual, but one detail required attention, a service visit logged the day before Daniel's disappearance, short, unremarkable, completed without issue. The technician assigned had no record of concern, no complaints, no irregular notes, just a completed task, signed, closed. On paper, it meant nothing, but investigators don't rely on paper, they verify. Hello, the technician was contacted, brought in for a standard interview, not accusatory, just procedure, because at this stage, everyone is just information. He arrived on time, calm, cooperative, the kind of person you don't remember after meeting. And that mattered because people like that move through environments unnoticed, not intentionally, just naturally. He answered questions clearly. Yes, he had visited the apartment. Yes, the work was completed. No, nothing unusual occurred. Everything as expected. Oh, his tone didn't shift. His posture didn't change. No visible stress. No hesitation, which at first suggested nothing. But experienced investigators know consistency can be just as telling as inconsistency. Because most people, when placed in a formal setting, show something nervousness, discomfort, subtle tension, even when they've done nothing wrong. But here there was none, not forced calm, just absence. of reaction, and that stood out. Uh-uh. The questions became more specific: timing, movement, details of the visit. Still, the answers remained aligned, clean, precise. But something was missing, not information, depth. Because when people recall real experiences, they include small variations, minor uncertainties, natural imperfections in memory. But his responses had none. They were complete, too complete, too complete. Again, not humor, just that quiet realization. Because perfect recall is rarely real. The timeline was compared. His visit ended hours before Daniel returned home, which meant there was no direct overlap, at least not on record, and that created distance. But distance doesn't eliminate possibility, it just changes its form. Investigators didn't push further, not yet, because pressure too early closes doors. And this case required them to stay open. Instead, they observed behavior, patterns, subtle reactions. Because people don't reveal information all at once, they reveal it slowly, in fragments, sometimes without realizing it. As the interview ended, one final question was asked: simple, routine. Did anything feel unusual during your visit? A pause, brief, but present. The technician shook his head. No. And that answer should have ended it. But it didn't, because something about that pause didn't align. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't uncertainty. It was recognition. Subtle, almost invisible, but enough. Huh. Enough to mark him, not as a suspect, not yet, but as something else, relevant. Shh. And in investigations, relevance is everything, because cases don't break open all at once, they narrow, slowly, carefully, until only one path remains. And when that happens, it's not dramatic, it's quiet. Like everything else in this case, by the end of the day, nothing had been proven. No conclusions reached, no accusations made. But something had changed. The investigation now had direction, not based on evidence alone, but on alignment of behavior, of presence, of subtle details that didn't belong. Because sometimes the most important person in a situation is the one who seems the most normal, the most cooperative, the least memorable. Ha, the one who doesn't stand out because they were never meant to. And once you notice them, you begin to understand something. Normal isn't always what it appears to be. Sometimes it's just the best place to hide, where everything still looks fine, even when it isn't. By the fifth day, there were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden discoveries, no clear confession, just accumulation. Details, small ones, quiet ones, the kind that don't feel important until they start aligning. And when they do, they don't create noise, they create clarity. The investigation didn't expand, it refined. Every piece of information was revisited, not for what it showed, but for what it implied. Because implication is where truth begins to form. The apartment, the timeline, the technician, individually, nothing definitive. Together, something else. A pattern, not obvious, but consistent. And consistency is difficult to fake. Investigators return to the timeline once more, not to confirm it, but to challenge it. Because strong cases survive pressure, weak ones don't. Daniel enters at 12:47. Phone activity at 12:51. Laptop active at 11:33. Then nothing. A complete stop. But now they looked at it differently, not as a sequence, but as a window, a narrow one, between presence and absence. And inside that window, something happened, something contained, something contained, something controlled. The technician's timeline was re examined, not just when he was present, but how he moved, entry, exit, duration, because behavior leaves structure, and structure can be compared. Building access logs were cross referenced again, this time with greater precision. and there it was, a small inconsistency, not in entry, but in exit, a delay, minor, easy to dismiss, but measurable, and measurable means real. Huh. The technician had remained in the building longer than recorded, not by much, but enough to create overlap, not direct, but possible. And possibility is where pressure begins, not accusation, just pressure. Subtle, controlled. A key was asked to return. Same room, same tone. Nothing confrontational. Because confrontation closes doors, and this case required them open. The questions were the same, but the context had changed. Now they weren't looking for answers, they were watching reactions. The technicians are the same way, calm, neutral, unremarkable. But this time there was a difference. Small, almost invisible, but present. Ha! The pauses were longer, not obvious, just slightly extended, enough to register. The question came again. Walk us through your exit. Simple, routine, but now specific. He answered, same words, same structure, but something had shifted, not the content, the delivery, less fluid, more deliberate. Ah, and that's when it happened. Not a confession, not a mistake, something quieter, more revealing, a correction. Ah, big sentence. He adjusted a detail, small, insignificant on its own, but unnecessary, because no one had challenged it yet. And unnecessary corrections don't come from memory, they come from awareness. Awareness of something that needs to be controlled. The room remained calm. No reaction from investigators. No interruption. Because moments like that require space. Space to continue. Space to unfold. Ah, the technician continued speaking. But now the structure was gone. Slight inconsistencies, minor shifts. Not enough to alarm, but enough to notice. And once noticed, they couldn't be ignored. The investigation didn't escalate, it narrowed quietly, precisely, because now they weren't searching, they were confirming. By the end of the session, nothing had been admitted, no direct truth spoken. But something had changed. The uncertainty was gone, uh, not replaced by answers, but by direction. And direction is enough. Because investigations don't end with clarity, they end with understanding. The understanding that something occurred within a controlled space, within a controlled window, involving someone who didn't stand out, someone who fit, someone who belonged, someone who understood the environment well enough to keep it looking unchanged. Ah, and that's what makes it difficult. Not the act itself, but the absence of disruption. Because when nothing appears wrong, people stop looking. They trust what they see. They accept what feels normal. Until something forces them to look again, to notice the small things, the quiet inconsistencies, the details that don't align. And once they do, everything changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but permanently. But permanently, because now they understand something important. Normal isn't always safe, calm isn't always harmless, and silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's maintained carefully, deliberately, to hide something that doesn't want to be seen. Uh, uh, and by the time it's already happened, already settled, already part of the space that once looked fine, but never was. And that's the part that stays with you, not what you saw, but what you almost didn't. Because sometimes the truth isn't hidden, it's simply unnoticed until it's too late.